One of the most popular pages on the Jesus Words Only website are the contradictions of Paul of Jesus. And in there is a section on just the salvation doctrine of Paul. So I'm going to summarize here Paul's salvation doctrine that most people are familiar with. And what I'm presenting here is this is what mainstream Paulinists believe. So some Paulinists, like 119 Ministries, claims that Paul, when he speaks differently, really means to be speaking differently, and therefore this is not Paul's gospel. But all 90% of Pauline Christians believe in the faith alone doctrine. You're not saved by works. You don't have to do any works. They're optional. You're eternally secure. You know the drill. So there is a group of you who are Pauline Christians who do not agree, and you believe you basically have the requirement to do good works. You don't do it, you will go to hell. You can't sin. You're not eternally secure, just on faith alone, and so on. So there's two groups, but 90% of Paulinists believe, those people who believe in Paul as inspired, believe that Paul is teaching what I'm going to show you here. So for you, I'm going to show you how Jesus addresses this identical issue, okay, in what's called the parable of the good servant. So we'll get to that in a minute. So I just want you to know I'm not ignorant. Paul's main salvation verses, and I contend they're at odds with Jesus. You're going to have to decide if I'm going to show you something today you need to see, and I'm going to do a deep dive on the parable, so there'll be no doubt in your mind. Romans 3, verse 28, man is justified by faith apart from observing the law. So not killing people, not committing idolatry, uh, all these commands in the Ten Commandments, not bearing false witness in court, adultery, coveting your neighbor's goods, all those things are not necessary according to this statement. And that's what you understand. You do not have to even read the Ten Commandments on any kind of daily basis, or even uh, memorize them, or know any. If I did a quiz with you on all 10, you how many would you name? And you'd say, I don't care. Most of you. Okay. That doesn't mean you say you're flagrantly going to violate them every day, but you don't concern yourself with them, right? Let's be honest. Romans 4, verse 5. To the man who does not work but trusts God, who justifies the wicked, the ungodly, by the way, his faith is credited as righteousness. So you believe that you are going to heaven because you had faith. And what was that faith? In 1 Corinthians 15, 1-4, you believe in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. I get it. You're saved. You're eternally secure. Galatians 5:4, you who are trying to be justified law have been alienated from Christ. You have fallen away from grace. So you actually believe if you try to be closer to God by obeying commandments in the 10 commandments, for example, you're actually alienating yourself from Christ, and you're doing the exact opposite of what you want to do. So that's why you actually do everything you can to avoid obeying God's law, because if you did, you would then fall away from grace. You're following Paul no matter where it leads. And I'm going to show you, when you see Jesus's words, it's not leading you to a pretty place. So, but I want you again to know, I understand completely your doctrine. Romans 7, verse 6. Now, by dying to what once bound us, we have been released from the law, so that we may serve in a new way of the Spirit and not in the old way of the written code. So if you read Romans chapter 7, he's actually saying by reading the rule against coveting, it made him covet. He wasn't thinking of coveting, but when it said do not covet, then sin arose in him. So he is saying that by getting rid of that written code where you actually read these commands that may put it in your mind to do these things that are evil, don't read them, get rid of the written code, and you'll be safer and less likely to do things that would be unpleasing to God, right? Romans 7 and Romans 7:6 is one of the key verses. So in my understanding, so if you don't agree with what I'm saying, then this isn't for you. That's, in other words, what I'm saying. So if I've got you correctly down, then this is for you. So let's keep going. Galatians 2:16. A man is not justified by observing the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ, because by observing the law, no one will be justified. So even though Moses said that if we obey the law, it will be righteousness to us, which is justification, Paul is actually obliterating Moses, because he claims Moses didn't get this from God. In Galatians 3:19, one more chapter away, he's going to say the law was not given by Yahweh, it was given by angels. I don't know if you all agree with that, because most of you may not remember that, but that if you can double check it, Galatians 3:19. So that's why he's saying you can't be justified except by faith and no one will be justified by the law, because in fact the law isn't what brings justification. But because why? Because the law was not given by anybody but angels. Yahweh's not even involved. So Yahweh's not even involved in the transaction. When you try to obey the law, you're not even obeying anything. He says to the Gentiles of Galatians chapter 3 who want to do Sabbath, and he says, if you want to observe Sabbath, you're trying to obey those who are no gods. I've worried. I can't believe you've fallen away that you now want to observe Sabbath. So am I right? This is how you understand it. You actually going the wrong direction if you read the law or try to do anything from the law. Ephesians 2:8-9, and this is the concluding one. For it is by grace that you have been saved through faith, this not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. So you actually believe that if you thought you had to do works for salvation, you would be tempted to boast. And the best way to prevent yourself from not boasting isn't to consider commands against boasting themselves, but rather not to try to do any good works that would lead you down the path of becoming a boaster. And that's literally what you understand this verse to be saying to you. And you know what? You're right. That's what he's saying. Now, let's turn to the Lord Jesus. So I'm going to stop there and we're going to come right back. Okay, now I'm going to ask you who are completely wedded to that point of view to just for a little while just open your mind to what Jesus teaches. That's all. And I think you have to always say, Doug, I'm ready to at least let Jesus check me. I'm not going to let you check me, Doug. I'm not going to let anybody else check me, but I'll listen to what Jesus says. I think that's the safest thing. That's a very safe thing to do, not just simply exclude Jesus because he didn't become king, supposedly, or whatever dispensational argument you've been told. You shouldn't even listen to what Jesus says. I think you know in your heart that if there's something from Paul that somebody claims can be is contradictory of Jesus, I should listen, right? At least I pray to God you'll listen. So let's listen to this because this is right on point. Because look at the parable as it reads here. The parable of the good servant who turns evil. So that's what this parable is. If you became a good believer in Jesus Christ and you then turned to evil, did evil things, are you still saved? Or should you be in mortal fear of going to hell? And that's what this is about. So if you are, you might act differently than if you think it's no big deal and you're eternally secure. So let's look at this. So first of all, I want to talk about the naming tradition of this parable. And Luke 12, verses 41-48, and Matthew 24, 44-50, I'm reading here, Jesus tells us the parable of the good servant who turned evil. However, traditionally, this has been called the parable of the evil servant. Okay. Yet that is a misnomer. It is the story of a good servant who turns evil. This is a very important correction in naming. So itself, the name has been incorrectly given to you. So that may impede your ability to know this about what you need to do, my friend. It helps us remember the point of the message. This is about the fall of a good servant into sin. It is just like the second seed in the parable of the sower. That seed believed for a while, but then fell away in temptation and thus withered and died. So it's really the same message. So you're going to hear it again. If you want to read the same thing, you just go to Luke 8 and verses 6 and 13. But this passage is the parable of the sower is really starts and ends very quickly. This is something Jesus is gonna give you a lot more meat to think about. Okay, in the Gospels, so now the overview. In the Gospels of Luke and Matthew, Jesus tells a story about a faithful and wise servant of the Lord. The servant is promoted over the household of his Lord. Then he gets tired of waiting for his Lord's return. Then this good servant engaged in sin, including mistreatment of fellow servants of his Lord. So there's no dispute this is a Christian, right? I mean, there's no doubt about it in the parable. He is also partying with the drunk. No doubt this is a Christian as well. Jesus says this servant who lost patience will find the master so displeased. What will happen? He will tear that servant apart and banish him with the hypocrites and the apistone. What's apistone? So I think maybe many Christians know this. The word pistis is traditionally used by Paul to mean faith. And the prefix "a" in front of a word means the negation of. So piston modified slightly is pistis modified slightly is pistone, and then you put an "a" in front of it, and so you're saying basically people who's are do not believe. So this once good servant who turned evil is put in the same place where those who do not believe ever are. Do you see that they go with the apistone? And this is translated generally as unfaithful, disobedient, or unbelievers. And the real meaning you should draw from this is apiston means those who negate the pistis that Paul tells me saves me. In other words, they don't have that pistis. They don't have faith. They were apiston. And where are they all going? Weeping and gnashing of teeth. So the hypocritical Christian, meaning the one who follows Christ, loves Christ, and then does not stay consistent with Christ, and you become a hypocrite. Okay. It's not that, and by the way, all Christians sin. So I'm not isolating you. Don't feel isolated that you're the only one who's going through this, but it's how we respond to sin in our lives, which makes our future either in hell or heaven. And that's what I'm trying to say. It's not a you're always going to heaven and there's no way out. And if Jesus says here something that is contrary to what you think other passages of the Bible said, then put those on a later research tab and then start researching those. And I cover them all in this book online for free called Jesus' Words on Salvation. I cover all the eternal security passages, so I show you what it really means. But let's get this one down because this is what helps you know what your Lord told you. So there's no doubt here, this is a person who once believed who's going to hell. So the eternal security passages that you think are eternal security, even from Jesus, not just from Paul, do not apply because you know Jesus is already refuting that if the reading I'm making of this is correct, and that's yet to be proven, right? We haven't read it yet. In Luke, Jesus describes a servant who oppresses the household of his Lord. Is this the same as the good servant Jesus described initially? Verse 42. And this is in Luke 12, if you see down here. And we're reading from the American Standard Version. And the Lord said, who then is the faithful, that is pistos is the word there, and wise or prudent steward, whom his Lord shall set over his household, to give them their portion of food in due season? Blessed is that servant whom the Lord, when he comes, shall find so doing. Of a truth, I say unto you, that he will set him over all that he has. But if that servant shall say in his heart, my Lord delays his coming, and shall begin to beat the menservants and the maidservants, and to eat and drink and be drunken, the Lord of that servant shall come in a day when he expects not, and in an hour when he knows not, and shall cut him asunder. And let me move this over slightly. And appoint his portion with the unfaithful, the apiston. And unfaithful really means there without people who never had faith, apiston. In Luke, there is no question but that the good and faithful servant is the same as a servant who later turns evil. Okay, now the version in the Greek Matthew. The parallel passage in Matthew based on the Greek version reads in the American Standard Version as follows. Therefore, be you also ready, for an hour that you think not the Son of Man comes, who then is the faithful and wise servant, whom his Lord has set over his household to give them their food in due season. Blessed is that, and that's a very important word, that servant, ekonos, servant. So he's talking about the faithful and wise servant. Who is that servant whom his Lord, when he comes, shall find so doing? Verily I say unto you, then he will set him over all that he has. But if that servant, that evil servant, meaning the one who's gone backwards, shall say in his heart, my Lord tarries. So he's still a servant, but he's not patient. He's going to then take this opportunity to do things that are wrong, and shall begin to beat his fellow servants. So they're still his fellow servants. Jesus saying they are still fellow servants of the same master, Jesus. And shall eat and drink with the drunken. Now they're doing things that are, basically wasting away their lives. The Lord of that servant, ekonos, again, shall come in a day. So that servant, he says 3 different times to make clear that you understand. He's talking about one servant, that servant who started out as a good servant, that servant who started losing patience and started being fellow servants. And now if that servant, the one who was good and turned evil, shall come, hold on. And shall begin to beat his and shall eat and drink. The Lord of that servant shall come in a day when he expects not, and in an hour when he knows not, and shall cut him asunder and appoint his portion with the hypocrites. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Matthew 24, verses 44 to 51. So Jesus just says you're going to go with all the people who say one thing and do the other, and that's the hypocritical person. What does verse 48 mean in Matthew? In the Greek Matthew, the King James and the American Standard Version reads similarly in verse 48. The King James reads this: But if that evil servant shall say in his heart, my Lord delays his coming. Matthew 24:48. To give traction to this view that the good servant turned evil ends up in heaven, Dillow. Now, this is a person who's, so I want you to know, I'm going to present to you how this is explained away by people who think Paul is teaching a completely grace-free, no sin. You can, if you're a true believer, you can never fall away. How do they reconcile? How do they cope with this? And this is they're not looking at Luke. They're going to look at this issue about that servant, and they're going to look at the Matthew passage. So I just want to show you. And so to me, these are such parallel passages in Luke and Matthew that they really can't be one taken apart and the other ignored. But that's what they're doing. Anyway, let's go look at it. Dello favors apiston rendered as unfaithful rather than unbelievers. So what did I tell you he's going to do? He prefers it. Why? Because it's more compatible with his view that maybe they were not Christians who became unfaithful. But what he's missing the point is Jesus is going to assign the Christians to a place of weeping and gnashing with the apiston. So whether unfaithful or unbeliever, it's not in heaven. There's no gnashing and weeping of teeth in heaven. But you'll see he actually believes that's true. You can have weeping and gnashing of teeth, but that's a whole nother issue. But you can't believe these things. That's ridiculous. Okay. Dillo has not successfully avoided. Hold on. So Dillo favors apiston rendered as unfaithful rather than as unbelievers. However, even if apiston means disobedient, which totally comports with our studies on pisto in John 3:16, Dillo has not successfully avoided that this place, the good servant turned evil, is hell. Jesus says in the more complete summary in Matthew that the good servant turned evil ends up in a place of weeping and gnashing. That's Matthew 24, verse 51. Elsewhere, Jesus said at the judgment, those ensnared by sin will be sent to the fiery furnace, a place where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. I mean, so it's unquestionably hell. It's not heaven. Matthew chapter 13, verses 42 and 50. Thus, the obedient or pistos servant, by later engaging in disobedience, goes to hell, a place of weeping and gnashing with the unfaithful or disobedient, whatever you want to call it. It's not really important who they are or what their name. He could have even never mentioned the word apiston. It's going to a place of weeping and gnashing of teeth in a fiery furnace is hell. And all Dillo is trying to say is, well, with the apiston means it could just be people who were, didn't have faith or hold on, let me just see what he said again. Unfaithful rather than as unbelievers. So he's thinking that this place is a place all for believers who are saved eternally, and they're going to hell, but it's like a temporary hell or something. Or he's ignoring, more likely, he's ignoring the words that Jesus says, a place of weeping and gnashing of teeth is hell. That's actually what he does. He's just ignoring that incongruity. Yet we see a variance between the Greek Matthew and what we read in Luke. For in Luke, we know the faithful and wise servant is clearly the same who turned to evil. So in that passage of Luke, there's no doubt. You have absolute assurance that the person who turns evil was a good servant. In Matthew, you have to realize the modifying word that is how you know that the good servant became an evil servant, because he doesn't change, and that's what the modifier that means. But Dillo is reading that out. He says, well, you had a good servant, and then Jesus hypothetically is just talking about a guy who's evil. And so you can maybe treat him as completely not a Christian. So he's giving himself every option to get out of this. In other words, you will find every escape, my friend, if you're a Pauline Christian, to get away from this. I'm going to take a break right now, and we'll come right back. Okay, so in other words, Dillo is trying to take advantage of the fact that Matthew is a slightly more ambiguous. Okay, and Luke isn't. He's not going after attacking Luke. He's attacking Matthew because it uses this that to make its point clear. But I think it's equally clear to Luke. But that's my point of view. But the fact that I even have to argue about it makes me wonder, well, maybe it's not as clear. I prefer Luke's passage. But regardless, let's go examine this. In the Greek Matthew, this meaning is less apparent. Jesus calls this person that evil servant, suggesting perhaps there's a new second servant who begins as wholly evil. The problem is also the word servant. How could someone be an evil servant? Means you're still a servant. You still have signed on to the club, and you are a follower of Jesus Christ, because that's what the meaning of the word servant is. So it's sort of unavoidable that this is a good servant, or a servant who could be good and could be evil. He's a believer in all cases. He just is in one case good, in one case evil. So it's a parable about morality. not about faith, except to the faith alone Christian. You are learning a lesson here that your faith doesn't save you. Just faith alone is not working the deal for you. You're told it does, and I've showed you the verses. I'm not disputing that Paul says those things, right? But you have to now say, is what Jesus says more important than what Paul tells you? But let's keep going. Nevertheless, even in the KJV and ASV, the Greek-based Matthew for verse 48, commentators agree it is the faithful and wise servant who turns to become the evil servant. All right. So even though there's a slight difference in the way Luke says it, which is absolutely crystal clear, and Matthew says it, which has this very arguable, really claim that that servant could mean, a completely different second servant is in view who's evil, and it's not a believer. And there's just no basis to that at all. And that's what the commentators agree. So here's an example. Barnes points out the literary structure of the parable dictates the good and evil servant are one and the same. The one who is faithful is appointed to be overseer, but then later abuses that position and turns evil. This Barnes says the evil servant is the same as the earlier faithful and wise servant. So that's clear in Luke, but allegedly, according to Dow and others, not so clear in Matthew. But he says, nope, that evil servant means if that servant so appointed, i.e., the good servant, having this office, should be evil or wicked. So he's saying if you read it in its real meaning, that's what it means. It's a good servant who turned evil. Likewise, Dillow admits the same at page 387 of Reign of Servant Kings of 1992. Dillow says that the Greek and the text structure requires us to understand the servant overseer who falls is the same as the faithful servant overseer mentioned earlier. Jesus is saying a once faithful Christian has turned to evil. The parable then serves as a warning to us. And by the way, I'm going to say to you, I'm puzzled by the guy because he's throwing out all these conjectures that would make you think he's not going to go to this conclusion, and then he goes there. So how does he hold on to his views? So let's read somebody who's admitting there's really no way around this. So let's read it. In the parable of the wise servant, i.e. the parable under discussion, the evil servant is after all a servant. See, he sees it too. What you can say, he's not a servant? Jesus describes him as a servant. If the wise servant is saved, there is no exegetical basis for implying that the evil servant is not. Well, now I'm not sure what he means. Is I think what Jesus is saying is at the point he was a good servant, he was heading in the right direction. He would be saved. But he changes and does something, and that's the question. So I'm not quite sure what Dilo means there to this point. In fact, the Greek text makes it plain that only one servant, not two, is in view. Then the Lord says, but if that, ekinos, evil slave says, 24:48, he's speaking of the same servant, the wise one of the preceding verses. So, I mean, he's trying to add some confusion there, but I don't see it. He's saying, yeah, I agree, it's the same person. Same person who, okay. So so anyway, I don't know where he was going. I don't know why he was saying it all, but that's the best he could do. And I'm just saying to you, my friend who's Pauline Christian, are you going to depend your whole salvation that some guy who ultimately his whole book is about saying you're saved by faith alone, and then he can't explain this one passage, and he gives you mealy mouth reasons to doubt it at first, and then he basically caves in. I mean, just saying. Other translations of the Greek Matthew are similar to Luke. In further support of viewing Matthew 24:48 to read just like the Lucan version, we find both the NIV and NLT translated to match the Luke version. That NIV version of verse 48 renders the Greek Matthew so it matches the Lucan version of that parable. The NIV reads, quote, but suppose that servant is wicked and says to himself, my master is staying away a long time. Likewise, the modern New Living of verse 48, Matthew reads comparable to Lucan version. What if the servant is evil and thinks my master won't be back for a while? So in each of those cases, you get to understand it's still a servant who then turns evil, who thinks some evil thoughts, becomes impatient. So it contains the same meaning of Jesus in the Lucan version of the same passage. Thus, in both the NIV and NLT, the Greek text is translated similarly to Lucan. They both evidently believe the underlying text supports saying that Jesus is warning about a good servant who turns evil. So again, I think there's really no dispute. But to make sure, I checked on the Hebrew original of verse 48 of Matthew 24. So there's this book called the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. It is a version that the Jewish people were keeping from the very beginning to keep track of what we were up to. And it shows actual evidence that it has first century language. And I can go into that, but I think it's too much to do here. One final proof, but no less important, is to examine the Hebrew version of Matthew. It appears to be the correct original version of what we read in the Greek translation of Matthew. All the early church commentators said the Greek Matthew was simply a translation of an underlying Hebrew original version. The Hebrew version had been thought lost for centuries. However, Professor Howard recently published a version of the Hebrew Matthew discovered in a medieval text. It has all the earmarks of containing the original Hebrew Matthew. Well, it does, but it still was held by Jewish people who are not Christians, who were just using it so they could debate with us. So they wanted to know what we were saying. So you have to always take that with a grain of salt. There could be something they put in there, but they're trying to know what we're saying. So it kind of gives you an idea of what the Bible historically said earlier and still was preserved indirectly by the Jewish people, Jewish scholars who wanted to know what we believed. So it still has to be read with a grain of salt just in case. It has very few variants from our Greek text, yet those variants often unlock gnarled syntax, such as in Matthew 24:48. There and in many other places, the Hebrew Matthew reveals our Greek New Testament is surely a translation of this original Hebrew version. The Hebrew version makes sense where our Greek version sometimes does not. And by the way, it seems to me that translating from Hebrew to Greek is not an easy task, and Nehemiah Gordon explains this in his book, very good book, recommend it highly, the Hebrew Yeshua versus the Greek Jesus. All right, continuing. Thus, it is often useful to use this medieval copy of the Hebrew text of Matthew to double check the Greek translation, which is in turn the basis of all English translations. So that means you might have to spend $19, maybe used $7, and get a copy of the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. It's in two editions, 1992, and I think an earlier one in 1989. Try to get the 92 version. The Hebrew Matthew provides in verse 48, but if that servant should be evil, the Hebrew Matthew, if that servant should be evil and should say in his heart, my Lord is late in coming. Now, the Hebrew version precisely matches the Lucan passage at a point where the Greek Matthew is at odds. So the Greek Matthew doesn't say it that way. It doesn't say right there where I put if that servant. So it's saying that servant, the one who was good, should be evil. It means does something evil, and should say in his heart, "My Lord is waiting." So clearly, by saying "My Lord," it's a reaffirmation by that servant that his Lord is, in this case, in the parable, he means Jesus. It means Jesus means this is someone talking about himself. So the Hebrew version matches Luke. It hence appears once again that the Hebrew Matthew helps restore the original words of Jesus. All right, I'm going to move on here. And so here's a table comparison. They are virtually identical when you use the Hebrew Matthew 24:48 and Luke 12:45. So let's read that. In Matthew, it says, but if that servant should be evil and should say in his heart, my Lord is late in coming. Luke, it says, but if that servant shall say in his heart, my Lord delays in coming, and shall begin to beat the manservants and maidservants, and to eat and drink and be merry. Okay, so now you can see it's absolutely saying the very same thing. And I think what it is there are several versions that correctly reflect actually the Hebrew Matthew in the our translations. That's the KJV, the ASV, uh, yeah, based on the majority text. So there are text traditions that are good, and there are text traditions that don't line up exactly the way Luke reads. So I'm just showing you in case you wanted to research this up to yin yang. I've double and triple checked every part of this so that you can be absolutely sure this is what Jesus said and this is what Jesus meant. And the Beck's manuscript line has it exactly the same between Luke and Matthew, although there is that different variant which Dillow tried to exploit, but ultimately came around and just said, you know what, they really are the same thing. It's a good servant who turned evil. All right. That's the kind of level of study you have to do to try to find out what's your duty as a Christian. Can I sin and go to heaven? Basically, can I just flout my responsibilities to obey God or Jesus' commands or whatever, and I'm still going to heaven? All right. So you're not finished the study of a parable until you identify each symbolic aspect. So the faithful and prudent phronimos in Greek servant is elevated by his Lord over his household. Thus, because the Lord here is a symbol of Jesus Christ, according to Barnes, and it's just logical, there is no doubt this faithful and wise servant is being correctly viewed as a faithful and wise servant by the Lord Jesus and towards him. Accordingly, it is important to note this servant begins as a true, not a nominal Christian. Then, as seen in the prior section of the book, okay, Jesus then explains if this faithful and wise servant should contemplate evil and starts oppressing others and reveling with the drunken, then the bad things identified in the parable will follow. Jesus explains the root cause of the fall of the faithful and wise servant is temptation. He had lost fear of his Lord's sudden return, whereupon he would be held accountable for his misdeeds. So that was one reason he did it. He didn't think he'd get in trouble. He believes the day of reckoning and judgment is to be far distant, says one commentator, Liscow, and thus he abandons himself to the more unrestrained indulgence of lusts. Liscow. Now, Apostle Peter likewise teaches by contrast that fear of imminent final judgment, where no favoritism is shown anyone, is one which leads you to sojourn in fear. Apostle Peter writes this in 1 Peter 1, verse 17 in the American Standard, and it reads, quote, "And if you call on him as Father," who's that? God, "who without respect of persons judges according to each man's work, pass the time of your sojourning in fear." So what did Jesus want you to have? Fear. When you sin, that you will be judged and you will not have time to rectify or fix whatever you've done wrong. Thus, this parable is clearly a warning by Jesus to those who are now truly faithful and wise servants, even those who have been elevated by the Lord to an overseeing position. That could be people who are in a church, a traditional church. Jesus is going to explain what happens if they lose fear of accountability and thereby turn to evil. So now this next thing is very important. We're going to now discuss the fall of the wise and faithful servant. So I'm going to take a break and we'll come right back. Okay, so how did the good servant fall? He reasoned in effect, why should I obey the master if he will not return promptly to hold me accountable for disobedience? This is evident in the thought in which preceded the evil deeds. Quote, but if that servant should be evil and should say in his heart, my Lord is late in coming. What is this Lord's servant's end for his disobedience? He will be torn apart and cast into the place reserved for the hypocrites and disobedient, as Barnes explains. The unfaithful and wicked minister of God who lives without expectation or fear of judgment shall suffer the severest punishment inflicted on sinners in the world of woe. Barnes is correct. However, he somewhat eviscerates his meaning by suggesting that the only Christians who need fear Jesus' threat are ministers. See, that's the other thing. So because it's a good servant, he tried to narrow the band of people. So that's another thing is they're going to try to claim, well, there are some Christians who aren't servants at all, and they're free from this restriction. So don't fall into that ridiculous trap. So he did that by changing the word from servant to minister. See, and don't go for that. We're all servants of Christ. Once you sign on, that's exactly what you are becoming a disciple. You are serving the Lord. That's what we're all doing. You can't get away saying, well, I'm going to avoid these downside risks by never becoming a servant. I mean, that's the absurdity of how some people read this. And that may even be what was being suggested by Barnes saying that. Anyway, so it's not an important distinction. Instead, any servant who loses patience for Jesus' return and who uses such delay to justify lack of concern over accountability is under Jesus' threat. It would be nonsense to suggest only ministers go to hell for evil deeds done by losing fear of the accountability upon Jesus' return. But the rest of us can frolic in sin if we lose such fear. No. We're all servants of Christ. So don't fall into that. That's what I'm saying. Moreover, to suggest the parable only applies to ministers is undercut the context. The warning in Luke 12, verse 45 is part of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus is addressing an innumerable multitude of people. Here, hence the warning is universal. Jesus presses his warning on all Christians. So that's another thing. You got to know the context sometimes when people say, well, this was a message for ministers. No, he's talking to common people, and they don't even know such a concept of ministers. So wrong use of words, Mr. Barnes. Jesus began the identical lesson in Matthew saying its point proves the necessity to be ready and waiting when he returns. Matthew 24, verse 44. Jesus wanted the crowds in Luke 12, 1 and 51 to have the same fear of an anytime accountability if Jesus should suddenly return. This constant fear of accountability and loss of salvation for disobedience would keep us from turning to debauchery and sin. That's what Jesus is telling you. If an obedient and prudent servant subsequently changes and commits evil, then his or her end is no different than the epistone, the unfaithful, or the disobedient, or the non-believer, and the hypocrite. Your end is the place of weeping and gnashing of teeth, Matthew 24:51. This was Jesus' shorthand expression for the fiery furnace where all sinners are sent by the angels on Judgment Day, Matthew 13:42 and 50. There's no secret where this is. It's not in the happy corner somewhere in heaven. knowing that you're saved, but you're just going to be kept in this corner for a while until you'll be let out of the corner, like mom and dad used to do to you in the house, punishing you. No, no, no. This is a corner that you can't open the door to get back in the house, and you're out forever. Okay, so thus, what of the faith, the pistis of the initially faithful and wise servant? He lost concern about any accountability for his actions, which brought his prior faithfulness, his pistos, to naught by sin. And that faithfulness included the initial faith and the obedience thereafter. But because he became lax, he just gave it all up. Robertson in Word Pictures explains this verse, quote, "That is the temptation that causes him to give way to indulge in fleshly appetites or to pride of superior intellect." Loss of fear was the root problem of the fallen, wise, and faithful servant. Jesus' exhortation in Matthew 24:44 signals that we must work on our expectations of being ever vigilant. By losing fear of an imminent judgment for our personal misbehavior, we are subject to the same temptation as the good servant turned evil. We will lose concern for our behavior if we no longer have a fear of his return and judgment at any time. Jesus is concerned we will become lax. Then we start sinning. This is the point of the parable. It is a warning to us about losing concern for being accountable to our Lord. I'm going to take another. Okay, so now, how does this stack up with what you've been taught about the gospel of faith alone? And I call it the gospel of cheap grace, my term. Interesting, the modern gospel of cheap grace feeds the precise assumption among God's servants that Jesus was condemning in the parable of the good servant turned evil. While cheap grace keeps up the constant hope of Jesus coming and rapturing us, it then negates the impact Jesus wants from such a constant expectation. Cheap grace teaches all believers are simultaneously assured that they cannot miss the rapture if they have ever once believed, hence the word cheap grace. No amount of disobedience or sinfulness will separate them from the salvation God supposedly promised them based on faith alone. As we will demonstrate below, cheap grace directly negates having any fear of accountability pertaining to our salvation, even if Christ returned today. Hence, the gospel of cheap grace precisely feeds us with the very identical assumption which caused the good servant to turn evil and lose salvation. Hence, my friends, I'm pausing here. Then, if you develop this attitude because of cheap grace, which it's not even an attitude, it's the doctrine of cheap grace, is the exact thing that Jesus says is the belief that Jesus is not going to hold you accountable if you're doing something wrong at all is encompassed within what Jesus is defining as what the servant who fell believed. He believed he wasn't going to be held accountable. It was going to be so far away, he wouldn't be held accountable. A cheap grace person believes he's never going to be accountable, no matter how long it takes, short or long it takes for Jesus to return. So there's absolutely no fear you have of losing your salvation, and therefore you are exactly in the mindset prone to lose your salvation unwittingly because you think you're eternally secure. And that's what I want to show you is not true. I mean, this parable proves to you that's absolutely false, right? All right. Examples of nothing to be guilty about once in Christ. I just want to show you, and to those people who are not inculcated or trained into Pauline Christian applications. This is Max Lucado, famous writer. I see him on TV, still talking. This is 2022. He's still giving talks about a Bible visit to Israel or something like that. Anyway, Max Lucado, Grip of Grace, Word, 1996, page 147, and compare it in your head to the message you just heard from the parable of the good servant turned evil. He says, the moment we begin asking those questions, and that is, will I be punished for sin? We have crossed an invisible line into the arena of fear. Jesus says that fear could be good. It's when you lose fear is bad. When you lose fear of accountability is what Jesus says is bad. What do you think he's going to say? Is fear good or bad here? Grace delivered us from fear. Ah, there is no fear. See, he just actually proves my point. This is how sad this is, my friends. But watch how quickly we return. I'd say watch how quickly you abandon Jesus. Grace told us we didn't have to spend our lives looking over our shoulders. Yes, that's what grace, the way you read it, says it, but Jesus tells us to always be looking over our shoulders. If you're sinning and I come quickly, you will be destroyed. So get away from sin. But Max Lucado sees it the exact opposite, 180 degrees opposite of the Lord Jesus Christ. He is supposedly a leader and pastor in our community, and he doesn't even get it. Did he ever study this passage? I can't imagine he did. How do these people go through seminary and never study a passage, and or they study it and they never come to any knowledge of any truth? What I really think happens is he was trained in grace alone first. Then he was allowed to read, and then they would try to give him superficial explanations, and he didn't realize he was never properly explained how this parable gets through the faith alone filter. It doesn't survive. The faith alone filter is crushed by this passage. But I digress. Grace told us we didn't have to spend our lives looking over our shoulders, but look at us glancing backward. Oh, we're going back towards fear. Jesus says what? Fear is good. In this situation, if you're sinning, see, he says the moment we begin asking those questions, meaning I'm going to be punished for sin. If you think you're doing something wrong that you could be punished for sin, he's saying you're going backwards. You're going away from Christ. No, you're going towards Christ. You're going towards what he told you to fear and not fall into laxity. See, this you are living, my friend, in a world where you have a choice. You've got to decide who you're going to follow. You're going to follow the Lord Jesus. You're going to follow somebody else who contradicts him. You've got to follow Jesus. If you don't, you'll be destroyed. That's really the answer. All right. I'm not going to go more into that sub issue because I want this to be wrapped up, but let's keep reading here. So he sells millions, Lucado sells millions of books on each new release. He's telling all the good and faithful servants they have nothing to worry about, losing your temper, oppressing someone, reveling with the ungodly. He says, don't worry about it. Problem is to get rid of the guilt, not the sin. Oh my God, help us, I say. In this way, faith alone doctrine has removed God as one to fear. This has led to a mesmerizing effect. No counter arguments are seriously weighed which refute faith alone. Think about it yourself, my friend. You don't want to give it up because it's your go-to. I'm a get out of jail card free every time. Any rationalization, even circular logic, is used by faith alone. And you saw it right there in the arguments of Lucado. What did he do? He downplayed the sin. He didn't even use examples of sin. He says, oh, if you lose your temper or you get grumpy, you're not going to lose your salvation. Yeah. What if I killed somebody, though? Tell me that. What would happen then? For otherwise, a convert would have to fear God. Any rationalization, even circular logic, is used by faith alone Christians to tenaciously reject Jesus' true doctrines. For otherwise, the convert would have to fear God, and thus this is frowned upon in sermon after sermon. They'll cite the verses, perfect love casts out all fear, 1 John 4, verses 17, 19, which, by the way, is true. If you perfectly loved God, you have nothing to worry about. It's when you're not when you're not perfectly loving God and you're sinning, now you have something to worry about or should worry about. So the very statement, perfect love casts out all fear, doesn't mean you have to drive all fear out of your brain. What it is it's to say, and that will mean you perfectly love God. No, no, no. It means if you have the perfect love of God, you perfectly obey him, you have nothing to fear. So it actually contradicts how they use that verse. To them, this verse means our love is already perfected through Christ's atonement once we accept it. We must therefore supposedly remove all fear of God. That's literally how they read it. The standard mainstream Pauline teachers, the Max Lucados of this world. I'm going to use him as my arch Pauline type that you should know exactly who I mean or what kind of doctrine we're talking about. Otherwise, we supposedly are still not even saved. So if you have any fear, it means you don't understand your own salvation, and therefore you're probably not saved. So they would say I'm unsaved because I believe in fearing God. Not only do I believe fearing God, but Jesus believes I'm supposed to fear God and supposed to be at the ready, but in fear that Jesus could come back any moment. And that's what he wants. He wants me to have that fear. So yes, I don't think that means I'm lost because I have fear of God. I think it's the other way. It's the opposite of what they say. It's almost anything they say, just believe the opposite and you're saved. You're in a better position. Otherwise, we supposedly are still not even saved. We would be supposedly denying the very objective of God giving us salvation if we ever again experience fear of God. So they're saying you're not even enjoying your salvation if you have any of this fear stuff. You know what? I only fear it when I sin. I got to repent and go back and be obedient. And that to me is a temporary problem solved by obeying. So it's not like I live in fear all the time. It's when you sin, then you should begin fearing. Okay, so I'm going to sign off, and you can read a lot more online. This article has a lot of other discussions of the ways people have tried to argue about this. There are many other commentators who try to squeeze this into a faith alone prescription, and so they ignore the whole point of the parable. But if you read it just on its surface and you don't listen to all the noise, you can just see that Jesus is totally in conflict with the gospel. You have been trained, and I was trained just like you. I believed in the faith alone gospel for so long. But once you let Jesus in the door and you give him where he belongs, he no matter what, he always is entitled to your preference over anybody else. I could be Peter, it could be John, it could be it has to be Paul as well. Is Jesus always comes first. If whatever he says has to be the authority that you follow in your life, because that's who he is. He is the prophet. He's the Messiah. None of these other figures, even an apostle, is not greater than the one who sent him. And on John 13:16, you'll have to pull up the Mountsey Transliteral in BibleGateway.com, because then you'll be able to see the word there is apostolos. But if you just rely on your King James, or you rely upon the NIV or whatever, you'll never see that Jesus said the apostle is not greater than the one who sent him. You'll see, basically other words in place of that. The messenger is not greater than the one who sent him, and so on. I think it was Jesus's point is he is greater than any apostle. So pull that up, memorize it, and then use that anytime you're tempted to fall back into a doctrine of faith alone. That is not the message of Jesus Christ. Okay, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe, and it helps drive more traffic to the YouTube channel. And thank you, and God bless you, and take care.